Welcome to everyone who's made the time today, at whatever time it is for you. We're very pleased to have with us two extraordinary individuals for our Martial Arts and Humanities series today. We have Patrick Radden Keefe, who is a martial scholar from 1999, and Joseph Gartin, the former Deputy Associate Director of the CIA, to discuss we hope a wide-ranging conversation on kicking off from Patrick's latest podcast, The Wind of Change, which investigates espionage and pop music during the Cold War. It's a pretty wonderful series. If you haven't heard it yet, I hope you'll get a flavor for it today and listen closely afterwards. Just by way of context, the Association of Martial Scholars is a membership organization, a nonprofit that has about 2,000 members, martial scholars from all over the world who've participated in the program. It's about 65 years old. And we are working hard to help share the expertise of the members with the broader public and foster strong ties between the United States and the United Kingdom in many different ways, in public programming and exchanges of different kinds. This Arts and Humanities series has kicked off since COVID. It's been covering a wide range of issues and substance, as well as kind of more entertaining and lighter and more enjoyable topics. And we hope this afternoon will be an opportunity to use your imagination and your compassion, as well as hearing some of the deeper and more challenging areas of substance that the intelligence community tackles day to day. By way of introduction, you're going to hear from Patrick Radden Keefe, who is an award-winning staff writer at the New Yorker magazine and the author of the New York Times bestseller, Say Nothing, a true story of murder and memory in Northern Ireland, as well as a couple of other books, which he may discuss. He has been a contributing staff writer to the New Yorker since 2006. And as I mentioned, is the recent writer and host of Wind of Change, an 8-part podcast series that was co-produced by Pineapple Street Studios, Crooked Media, and Spotify. We are very pleased to welcome Joseph Gartin to talk with Patrick. He is a national security professional with over 30 years of experience in the U.S. intelligence community. He recently retired from the CIA as Deputy Associate Director of the CIA for Talent and Chief Learning. He oversees, where he oversaw learning and development programs for its entire global workforce. Previously, he was the Dean of the Sherman Kent School for Intelligence Analysis and Vice Chair of the National Intelligence Council and Director of the President's Daily Briefings. We're so pleased to welcome Joseph and Patrick, and I will turn it over to them to kick off the conversation, and maybe Patrick can provide, for those who haven't heard, a little bit of context around this series and help that be a jumping off point for today's discussion. So I turn it over to you both, and I will maybe put my video off so you can just see each other. And then just by way of housekeeping, we'll have this conversation, and then if you would, if the audience can put questions into the Q&A box, we'll field them about halfway through. So Patrick and Joseph, over to you.
Thanks, Nell, and thank you, Joe, for doing this with us, and thank you all for joining us today. This is a real treat. By way of background, because I suspect maybe some of you have heard the podcast, but probably some of you know nothing about it. And the pitch, the idea that it's about pop music and intelligence during the Cold War, may raise questions in your mind. I'll give you the kind of a brief overview of what this was. I'm a staff writer at the New Yorker. I have written occasionally in the past about intelligence issues, but it's not my beat by any stretch. And I heard a crazy story almost a decade ago in 2011. A friend of mine who has often been a source for me told me this wild story about a band called the Scorpions, which some of you may know, a West German heavy metal band, which was together for decades and had a song that came out in 1990 called Wind of Change. And Wind of Change was sort of a power ballad, a metal ballad, very typical of a certain kind of song of that era, with a very famous whistled refrain and a message about people coming together and peaceful transition that kind of captured the moment of what was happening in Europe. The song was recorded just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and ended up becoming, I think, for a lot of people in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet bloc, kind of the soundtrack to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I was not a Scorpions fan, not a metal fan, was kind of ambiently aware of this song, but not of the iconic role that it had played during that period. And my friend Michael, who had given me important tips for various stories in the past, told me back in 2011, that song he had heard from somebody at the CIA, that song was not actually written by the Scorpions, it was written by the CIA. And this was, to put it mildly, a compelling lead. And I started to dig into it. And normally when I get a really fascinating tip like that seems a little too good to be true, I'll go to the well a few times and kind of come back empty. But in this case, the more I dug into it, the more I discovered this long history of influence operations during the Cold War, in which the US government in general and the CIA in particular had at different times used pop culture and pop music as a wedge in the ideological battle with the Soviets. For years, I kind of nursed this secret project and would ask people about this ridiculous rumor I had heard at different points. And for a variety of reasons, I felt like it probably couldn't be a New Yorker article, and I'm happy to talk about that more if that's of interest. But a couple of years ago, about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, I realized that what it really wanted to be was a podcast in which I explore this outlandish rumor and a series of kind of deeper questions about intelligence and influence operations and culture and geopolitics in a way that was hopefully offbeat and fun. And I spent about a year doing it and put together this 8-part series, which was released a few months ago. So I hope some of you have heard it. I would encourage others to do so. But I think even if you know nothing about the series, hopefully Joe and I will have lots to talk about.
Patrick, thanks for having me here today. I'm honored to talk to you and then to have such a distinguished audience. And I really look forward to the conversation. I'll say from the outset, I love your phrase about sort of ambiently aware of the Scorpions. Like you, I'm not a Scorpion fan. Maybe the greatest service you performed for me in the podcast was explaining what the first 2 lines of that song were. I never could quite understand it. Once it was clear, you can't unhear it. And it is like, it is iconic. But honestly, I had no idea what the opening lines were. It's such a fascinating story, and like many stories, both in your line of work and in my line of work, they are stories sometimes without neat and easy conclusions. And I think your podcast really captured, for me, the complexity of trying to approach this kind of story and setting the listener in the milieu of that period. So look forward to the conversation today.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, it's funny you should say that about the ambiguity and the idea of not having a neat resolution. That was in some ways part of the reason I wanted to do it as a podcast, is that I feel as though, for reasons I haven't been able to quite put my finger on, there's something about that medium which kind of tolerates or indulges a degree of empirical ambiguity that to me, a New Yorker, a 10,000 word New Yorker article does not. If, in my experience, if you, and certainly at the New Yorker, when we talk about ideas for potential stories, if it's a mystery and you know on the front end that you might not solve, that at the end you might say, and we'll never know. There tends to be a sense that most people, having spent 45 minutes with that article, are going to want, they'll want their 45 minutes back. Whereas with podcasts, I think in part because of the intimacy of having a voice in your ear, and in part because the whole genre was in some ways defined by Serial, which is this big kind of groundbreaking podcast where the whole thing hinges on this question of whether the guy at the heart of it did or didn't kill his girlfriend. And at the end, they say, we'll never know. But that there's a sense in which you can explore process in a way that that I hope doesn't feel unduly self-indulgent.
Yeah, I think the story itself, the fundamental question about, well, who wrote the song, provoked for me a couple of reactions, which again, I think get at sort of your line of work and my line of work for so many years at the agency. The first sort of overarching issue for me was really what you're talking about is a creation myth, right? And as a creation myth, who created the particular song, who wrote it, those myths, they take on an importance, a sort of social, cultural importance over time. And they get smoothed out and the wrinkles get ironed out and the rough edges get rubbed off and characters drop off and new characters are invented to help smooth out the telling of a story, the narrative of that story. My other reaction was, I think, quite common when I listened to podcasts as an intelligence professional, which was, could we have done that? Yeah, probably. I mean, that makes sense. I should say, just as a matter of fact, that I've never heard that story until I heard your podcast and read some articles about it. It's conceivable. Unlikely, I thought at the end of the day, but an intriguing kind of open-ended question that someone could spend a decade trying to run down.
Someone who probably had better things to do. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because a big part of what I started to wonder about was that I interviewed a bunch of former intelligence professionals, some of whom were active in that time and space, and the reaction pretty consistently was what you just said. It was haven't heard that story myself. Wouldn't rule it out. We particularly in the kind of late phases of the Cold War, we were trying all kinds of things, and part of what was so intriguing to me from it's funny, the CIA and intelligence, I feel as though it gets written about constantly in the press and fictionalized and dramatized constantly in Hollywood. But to me, there was there was an angle that we stumbled upon, which was almost anthropological, that became really fascinating to me about the lives and the careers of intelligence professionals, in the sense that it's a classified world and it's often a pretty highly compartmented world. And so I had to kind of check myself after a little while, because people would say to me, oh, I wouldn't rule it out. It might have happened and I just wouldn't have known about it. Nobody would say categorically that it hadn't happened, which initially I took to be a sign that, oh, this story's got to be true. But then, of course, when I thought about it, I thought, in the world where you spent your career, it's kind of the nature of things, right? I mean, there may be rumors that go around, but it's also the case that there are probably very important stories that the workforce at large, never mind the general public, but that the workforce at large, even within the CIA, just never learns.
Yeah, that's definitely the case, and for the reasons that you said, right? That there's a compartmentalization that exists for a really good reason. You're protecting sources and methods, as some of the folks in your podcast indicated. And on top of that, you take a solemn oath, a vow, when you join the agency, in addition to signing a lot of papers that say, I won't reveal the things that I I've learned about. And that extends, I think, in your working life within the intelligence community. And the same is probably true for, I don't know, law enforcement, or maybe some aspects of practicing law where, and I thought you got at this in the podcast, where there are unseen barriers that exist between individuals and organizations in which the participants themselves understand, I don't want to ask that question. I shouldn't ask that question. I'm not able to ask that question. And if I ask the question, you might not be able to answer it. So I won't put you in that position of asking you that question. And I think about this a lot. I've thought about this a lot over the years. There are secrets within any organization like the CIA, naturally enough. Then there are real secrets, right? Some secrets become public knowledge for one reason or the other and through one means or the other. But many other things themselves, those secrets are never revealed for good reasons. Identities of individuals that need to be protected, operations that need to be safeguarded, decisions that need to be protected, processes that need to be protected, so that you can continue to do what you're authorized under the law to do as an intelligence organization.
I mean, so what did you, when you said there are secrets and then there are real secrets, what was what's the distinction?
I think it came out early on in the podcast when, and I can't remember who, but when someone recounted to you that they had heard this story. And then when you asked them about it later, they said, no, I can't talk to you about it. Right? It's like it's a felony. To me, that really resonated because what it told me as an intelligence professional listening to the podcast, that someone had overstepped a bound. They thought that perhaps they'd overstepped a bound and didn't want to pursue it with you anymore. Yeah. So it's one thing to say, I worked at the CIA. It's not a secret. I did these sorts of things. They're not secret, or they're not secret anymore, or they're because they've been unclassified or they've entered the public domain in one way or the other, and have been declassified or subject to a FOIA release. But then there are, as I said, I think sort of real secrets that each person in the intelligence community would carry with them and hopefully would respect and protect. And that line, I think, might differ for individuals, but almost everybody knows when they're about to step on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, that you know, this was a kind of a funny moment for me. For those of you who haven't heard the podcast, the way this whole thing came about is that my friend Michael was told this story by a guy who he knew who had been in the agency. And that guy said that he in turn had heard it from another person when he actually first got to the agency, when he was at the farm and he was training, that there was a kind of a graybeard, somebody who'd been around for a long time, who came out to tell war stories from the Cold War, and that this was one of the stories that he told. And so we had this kind of strange moment, which is in the first episode of the podcast, where the first step for me was to get this guy who had relayed the story to Michael to tell me the story. And I hoped he would do so for the podcast itself. But when we approached him, he really freaked out. And it was from a kind of repertorial point of view, it was an odd moment in the sense that, you know, in the immediate sense, it was discouraging because this is a source, you want to get it to him. You want to take it from a third-hand story and turn it into a second-hand story. So at least it's the guy who was in the agency telling me he'd heard it from the graybeard. But at the same time, the panic that he felt, the alarm that I could hear in his voice, told me that, you know, this is pretty serious, that it's, you know, it is a real secret, as you say. The tricky thing there, though, is that I then, as I kind of pushed in and spent a year talking to people about this stuff, I realized that that even inside the CIA, there's a certain amount of urban legend too, and there are stories that get passed around that may, they may be mostly true or somewhat true, but they evolve, even in an organization that is devoted in part to analysis, right, and what you would think would be the kind of rigorous stress testing of different accounts of things that are happening in the outside world, there's a tendency for a story as it gets passed along to evolve. And that maybe that's a particularly pronounced tendency in a world in which everything's classified. So it's very hard to check it, to expose it to, the sort of scrutiny you would get when somebody gives a speech at a convention and is fact checked the next day.
Yeah, that's what I meant when I said it. To me, it felt a little bit like a creation myth, in which the various players want to ally themselves with that particular story for one reason or the other, or to disavow any relationship with that particular kind of story. Organizations like the CIA depend on myth making internally because you ask a lot of your employees to separate themselves somewhat from things that others might take for granted, to be open about where you work and what you do and who you work with and how many people you work with, whatever it might be. You ask a lot of an intelligence officer that you don't ask of other kinds of workers. And in addition, as I said, you require every employee to take a vow, an oath, which lasts forever, right? It's not only in your period of employment, the obligation to protect classified information is perpetual. And so the myth-making piece of any organization, I think like the CIA, and it applies, I think, to lots of other specialized organizations, Navy SEALs or Green Berets or maybe firefighters or policemen and women, where you're asking particularly difficult things of that group of people. And so one way to ensure the cohesion of any organization like that is in that internal myth making. And I could really see some gray-beard, senior retired officer, like I'm soon to be, a gray beard, saying something that he or she thought was in fact the truth and sharing it in a forum in which he thought was private. Mm-hmm. For the particular purpose of saying, you are special. You people are special. What you do is special. We're special. And by the way, did you know this thing?
Yeah. I mean, so I wondered when you talked about myth making. So what are the myths, and how does that myth making function to the degree that you can speak in general terms?
Well, I guess maybe one aspect, and this maybe is a transition to sort of think about if folks have questions later about working in the intelligence community, is what you do is special, and you're the good guy, right? You can't enter an organization like the CIA without holding that sort of fundamental truth to yourself, which is that I am working in an organization that we know is occasionally flawed, and sometimes in ways that make the news and other times do not. But fundamentally, the work of collecting, analyzing, and disseminating intelligence information to a policymaker, decision maker, or warfighter is really important and honorable work. And that's, to me, the story that you want to tell to your employees, especially as you're onboarding, to say, here's the kind of work that we do. Here are the lessons that we've learned along the way. And here's where we're going and how we need you to help us get there. I think that myth-making piece is really important.
Yeah, it was fascinating because in some of these conversations, another thing that was really striking to me, and I did think about this in terms of, you know, what it would be like to have a career at a place like the CIA, is that, you know, the stories themselves are often amazing stories. And yet there's this paradox, right? Which is that you're signing on, particularly if you're an operational person, you're signing on for a life that is, you know, by most definitions, wildly, you know, adventurous and interesting and intriguing. And you're also making a pledge that, you know, there will not come a time when you're at liberty to share those stories, you know, in some instances, even with your own family. And that as a result of that, the kind of tradition within the agency of passing those stories down takes on a special relevance, right? Because there is this sense that inside these walls, we can maintain a kind of oral tradition of the crazy things we've done. And indulge that quite natural instinct that people have, right? To say, you'll never believe the craziest thing that I experienced.
Right. I work with someone on the National Intelligence Council who was not a career intelligence officer. He joined the NIC for 3 or 4 or 5 years out of academia. And one of the things that he would say to me from time to time was about the job was learning that, oh, wow, we did that. That's really cool. And so it can be somewhat intoxicating, I suppose, in a sense, to be part of that kind of community. You know, as an organization, in order to be healthy, I think the flip side of that is avoiding a situation in which you are mythologizing every action, every operation, every bit of analysis, every collection attempt, in such a way that you're not able to evaluate yourself clearly and appropriately to say, well, were we really effective? And it's easy, I think, particularly in the sort of environment, social media environment that we're in today, in which you can spin really deep and complicated caverns of conspiracy that you can't get out of, and you can't reason or explain your way out of. Because every rational argument about why this did happen or didn't happen can be countered with some invented fact. And that's a broad social problem where the public can look at any particular event or activity and say, well, that's not the real story. But it can be, I think, also internally a problem. It would be better, I think, to have said, if that senior official had said, you know, that song, well, we probably didn't write it, but it was part of the environment that we had hoped to foster through our actions approved by the president, conducted with the assistance of people all around the intelligence community and maybe our allies and friends to achieve some particular aim.
Yeah.
Now, what I just said is kind of boring. It's better to say, you know, that song "Wind of Change," we wrote that.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's interesting to hear you say, yeah. One thing I wonder about in terms of that notion of, I mean, to your friend's point, that getting to the NIC and suddenly getting read in on a bunch of stuff and seeing it in a way a different version of our history, right? A kind of alternative history. I can see how that would be intoxicating. I guess I wonder from an institutional point of view, the danger I would think, and I don't think this is exclusive to intelligence agencies. I think it is a kind of curious creature of, you know, in the national security bureaucracy in general and the executive branch, there can sometimes be a tendency towards a certain bunker mentality that says, oh, if the people out there only knew the things that we know, that we have a kind of omniscience that's not, that the person out there carping in the New York Times or on Twitter doesn't have. And if they only knew what we know, then they would understand that our every deed is righteous. I mean, I think that's a sort of drift or an instinct that you can see, I would think, in any kind of national security bureaucracy. I wonder how, from your point of view, whether for the CIA in particular or other organizations that are similarly situated, how do you prevent that phenomenon from creating a bunker mentality and a kind of groupthink in which it becomes very difficult to point at something and say, all right, that was actually a big mistake. We lost the plot there. We need to re-examine the way we do things.
I think key mechanisms for that kind of self-reflection, which I would agree are profoundly important. I think key mechanisms for that are things like they're really structural and process related. So it's publications like Studies of Intelligence. It's institutions like the Inspector General. It's red teaming to look at an analytic argument to say how you might be getting this wrong or how this particular operational act could go wrong. And I think also sort of recognizing the limits, the fundamental limits of intelligence. It is a tool of policy. It is not an objective in and of itself. It exists to further the US government's goals. And as such, should be subject, I think, to the kind of external scrutiny and wherever possible, even public scrutiny, so that you have a check on what is otherwise an organization, whether it's a CIA or other elements of the national security apparatus, are imbued with enormous influence and strength within the government. And along the way, you need checks on that. And that's why within the Director of National Intelligence, there is a Chief Transparency Officer, and to help the organizations across the intelligence community look at how they are operating, and to make sure that, to the extent possible, that you can share that information with the U.S. public.
Yeah, and I mean, I would think that the congressional committees must.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of a sort of an outside entity that does have the clearances. I realize that this stuff can get politicized and unhelpful at times, but that's structurally that would be an important consideration.
Yeah, no, thanks for reminding me, because I should not have left that out. Clearly, congressional oversight through the HPSCI and CISI and the authorizing committees is really, really important too.
Yeah, interesting. Now, I don't know if do you want to, how do you want to handle questions?
Yeah, sorry. There are a few questions coming in. Jamie Kwong asked sort of to kind of step back and talk about your process and how you approach a really kind of multifaceted story, and how you let information flow in, and the surprises take you through different threads while also keeping a structure that's the big picture. How do you approach that, given the complexity of the story that you handled in the podcast?
Boy, good question. So I do, most of what I do is this is the first time I've ever done a podcast, and most of what I do is these long articles from the New Yorker and then books. And that's a real luxury in the sense that the New Yorker pieces tend to be these big, long narrative pieces where I have by journalism standards, a lot of time to work on them, and pretty, good resources as these things go. And so I say it's a luxury in the sense that sometimes the story takes a turn. And if I were a newspaper reporter on a deadline, it's tough to deal with that kind of thing. Whereas, as a magazine writer, I'm trying to think of a good example. I wrote a piece a number of years ago about a guy who was this guy, Hervé Falciani, who worked at HSBC in the private bank in Geneva. And he stole a huge volume of data from the bank and ended up leaking it. And he was sort of described in a bunch of initial press accounts as like the Edward Snowden of banking, because he was, revealing all this information about the way tax evasion functioned in a private bank in Switzerland. And I wanted to write a piece about him. And so I flew to Paris to meet with him and sat down for what became a 4-hour interview. And 30 minutes, I would say, into the interview, I had this just absolutely gut-punching realization that this man was a compulsive liar, that he was totally unreliable. His story didn't make any sense. And I was kind of devastated because I felt like, well, there goes my piece. How can I can't write about this guy, given all the lies that he's telling me, these kind of fantastic explanations for what he was doing. And I started to think that he might just actually have been a thief, that he was looking to sell the data and didn't have any interest in transparency or accountability per se. And he was kind of wrapping himself in the mantle of accountability after the fact. And another type of journalist might have just abandoned the piece, and I did for a while. But in that case, I came back to it. Several months later, I realized, what if you took his unreliability and actually made it part of the story and had some fun with it? And so I ended up doing this piece, which is in part about the fact that there's this guy who does this thing, but is totally unreliable, and his story keeps changing, and he's a sort of a big and interesting character. And I feel as though a 10,000 word magazine article lets you do that in a way that is tough to do in some other formats. But he was a character. And so that's one of the big things for me, is I'm often drawn to characters. And I feel as though, I have colleagues at the New Yorker who can write amazing pieces about a kind of a phenomenon or a policy question. And they kind of start from the top down. And for me, that's really hard. I tend to need, I think there's something, I think we are wired to process stories more fluidly when the different roles are personified and you feel like you're kind of following interesting characters through a story. So, whether it's my last book, which is about the IRA and the Troubles and follows a series of characters quite closely in order to tell a larger story about the Troubles, or even Wind of Change, where it starts with a question, but really the kind of, the sort of Colonel Kurtz, if you will, at the heart of it is Klaus Meine, the diminutive lead singer of the Scorpions, who, is this kind of slightly larger than life character until we meet him finally in episode 8. That becomes an organizing.
There are quite a few questions asking you to unpack that experience a little bit more and describe, at least to this group, what it was like talking with him, and if he was totally dumbfounded by what you were asking, or what that interaction was like, if you wouldn't mind.
I wrote big pieces about Chapo Guzman for the New Yorker, and have profiled some kind of big bad billionaires, kind of quite intimidating people. So it was funny for me, just because I was as nervous as I've ever been for an interview when I was going to sit down with this 70-year-old weather-beaten German rocker. He was very charming, and I didn't know how it was going. I truly did not know what he was going to say. I worried a bit that he would be angry. And And that it would have been an interesting question about how do we end this podcast in a way that doesn't just feel like we're harassing this poor man, had he gotten angry. But he was sort of perfect because he was either very surprised or feigning surprise extremely well. He was totally good-natured about the whole thing, and he was very enigmatic. I mean, if you look at the things he said, if I was sort of scripting it as a movie, or in a novel, and you wanted to preserve the ambiguity, he could not have been more obliging in terms of how he did that, which is maddening, but I think made kind of a fun answer. I mean, the one last thing I would say on that, which is just kind of a funny little footnote, about the difference between magazine journalism and podcasts, is that I had to be sort of coached to change my interview style when I started doing audio, because my tendency, if I'm talking to somebody, like if I was interviewing Joe for a story and there was an awkward silence and I could tell that he felt awkward, my instinct would always be to rush in and fill the silence to put him at ease and keep him talking. And so initially that was what I would do in the interviews, and my producers had to tell me, you can't do that. Like in audio, silence is gold, and you don't want to blunder into it with your follow-up questions, and kill that magic. And so I had learned that lesson by the time we interviewed Klaus. And so if you listen to the interview, there's when I spring it on him, he keeps saying no, but with these long pauses in between each one. And he keeps saying that, he keeps sort of intonating the no differently each time. So I was very happy afterwards with how that came out, but it only happened because my producers had been goading me for months at that point. Just shut up and let him stammer.
So that's great. There are a couple of other threads and themes in the questions. One about declassification, and maybe Joseph can also talk about that, like how that works and what the time frame for declassification is, and if that changes your view on the story, and more broadly, sort of the concept of influence and how the CIA and intelligence agencies work with influence, even if they weren't a songwriter. What the approach to influencing culture and opinion is. So those are sort of questions.
You want to take the classification question?
Yeah, I mean, I can take a little bit of a stab at that. I'm now getting to the point where I'm old enough that I think things that I wrote 30 some years ago are on the verge of automatic declassification, which as an intelligence professional is a little bit unnerving. There is a process for it. If you're inside the organization, you think it's probably a really good process of careful and deliberate review of materials. And if you're on the outside trying to do a FOIA request, you might think it is obstruction and bureaucracy. Somewhere in between is probably where I think the truth lies. Most information declassifies automatically, or is up for review automatically, I should say, after some set period. Usually it's 25 years, sometimes it could be 50 years. To me, it's best, I think, when the community as a whole collaborates and makes good decisions about declassifying large collections of materials, as I think was done with President's daily briefing materials from the Kennedy and Johnson era that were recently released. That's really helpful because it sheds a light on really important periods of history. Closer to the present, I think one of the troubles of declassification and public release can be it can easily become a political football. And that's not really where the intelligence community wants to be. It needs to really be approached carefully and thoughtfully, not only from the standpoint of protecting information, but also avoiding a situation in which the intelligence community could be seen as sort of pouring gasoline on any particular fire.
Yeah, I mean, I might add to that that the, you know, we had this kind of interesting thing with Wind of Change where there was it happened a long time ago, right? So you're talking about 1990, and we're coming up on 30 years, and there was this question, which is like, is it something that's still classified? And the weirdness of GLOMAR and the way in which the CIA responds and other federal agencies respond to Freedom of Information Act requests, you know, sometimes saying we can neither confirm nor deny, it's kind of maddening from the outside, right? Because it's not necessarily saying, yes, there is something classified, which we won't tell you. It's literally saying, like, we're not going to go one way or the other. So you shouldn't conclude, even from the fact that we're saying we can neither confirm nor deny, that there's anything that we're neither confirming nor denying. So you can get into kind of a bit of a trick box trying to work this stuff out. But gaming it out with my producers and trying to figure this out, there was this question of, and talking to some of these former intelligence officers who we spoke to for the podcast, there's a question, well, why would it, if it was still classified, why would it still be classified? Because in a way, wouldn't this be the kind of story you would want to get out there? And there were a few answers for that. I mean, all of which are interesting. You know, one is that it might be that there were people who were involved. This is all hypothetically, let's hypothetically assume it's true in some fashion for a second. So there are people involved who, you know, were exposed in one way or another and don't want it to come out. And so that's one possibility. Another possibility that a number of people raised in the podcast is that there's a method, you know, it's not a source, it's a method, and there's a method that could still be being used. And that sort of, you know, that's also really intriguing. And maybe as a segue to the question about influence operations, this for me was one of the biggest revelations of the project, was just that when I first heard this crazy story, I thought, oh, there's no way. What would this ever have to do with music? It's sort of laughable on its face. And then I started digging into the history, and there is this whole long history of the agency during the Cold War, dabbling in various types of culture, you know, high culture, pop culture, art, letters, music, you name it. And there are a number of stories we tell on the podcast about, you know, we tell a story about Louis Armstrong, which is not a CIA operation, but the State Department sending Louis Armstrong on an African tour at a point where you had decolonization happening across the African continent, in this sense that there were these new nations which were sort of up for grabs, and they might, you know, there was this question of which camp are they going to fall into? Will they align with the Soviets or with the West? But at the same time, for Armstrong, you know, there's this context, which is that he's been sent abroad to represent the United States at a time when, you know, it's the early days of the civil rights movement. Jim Crow is still very much alive and well in the United States. And so he had this kind of deep ambivalence about being used, frankly, as a kind of spokesperson for this country, you know, which in some ways he felt didn't represent his interests domestically. There's another story we tell about Nina Simone, going on a tour herself, which she actually didn't realize had been sponsored by the CIA. So there are instances in which these types of influence operations have been used. And in the course of the podcast, I learned about others, some of them much more recent. We didn't tell all those stories, but I mean, you know, to this day, this kind of thing is happening. There are various places around the world in which the US government tries to exert soft power effectively by saying, look, how can we focus on young people? How can we change hearts and minds? You know, whether it's trying to sort of lead young people away from you know, you don't want them to become jihadis. And so you find sort of various cultural vehicles to try and get at them. And there's a great quote from Eisenhower that we cite in the podcast where, you know, Eisenhower said the thing about propaganda is it doesn't really work if people know it. People know it's propaganda. So you want to find vehicles for it, cultural vehicles, where the hand of government is hidden. So to me, that's a kind of even outside the context of the Scorpions story, it was just a big, fascinating, vexing backdrop about which I think reasonable people can differ and argue, you know, about the ethics of doing that kind of thing, about the efficacy of doing that sort of thing. And it was part of what I wanted to do, was kind of bring some of those stories to light.
Do you feel that that's changed, or is changing in real time with the advent of digital culture and the internet? And now obviously we're seeing things play out with TikTok, and but how the intelligence community is responding to a kind of new conveyor of culture. Are you seeing a different approach? I guess it'd be interesting to both of you, how you see this sort of influence strategy changing with the way culture is disseminated across the world today.
I mean, Joe no doubt knows much more about this than I do, and I'll now give him the opportunity to not tell us.
If I did that, I wouldn't tell you. But like, I think here's things you can sort of take, I think, sort of generically from Mel's point, which is it's, I think, an enormously challenging environment for the U.S. government or any government, a foreign government or U.S. government, to operate. The speed of the evolution in social media as new platforms emerge, are adopted and then dropped. The sophistication of the messaging, the quality of the messaging, all of that, I think, rapidly evolves and poses a particular challenge for just like government-driven influence and messaging or soft power operations. I say that because I think there is a tendency at times to probably overvalue or maybe overstate the value of intelligence-driven influence operations. That they exist within a broader context and they may or may not be effective. Any more so than a broader effort. So a particular concert tour can be helpful potentially if you're trying to message US policy in the 1960s in sub-Saharan Africa, but they're existing within a broader context, and no operation can overcome that sort of weight of public opinion attitudes. They can really only shape on the margins, my particular view.
I mean, I'd add just two quick things. One is that I couldn't pretend to understand what's happening behind the scenes now, but one of the things that was fascinating about spending a year, the particular year that I did working on this project is that the backdrop was, you know, the Mueller investigation and, you know, a lot of coverage of Russian interference in the 2016 election. And, you know, you need look no further than, it seems to me that Twitter to some degree, but really Facebook is probably the vanguard of this type of thing today. And, you know, I think that story, it's going to take a while for that story to be written in a kind of comprehensive way. But I do think when you look at the cultural and political power of a platform like Facebook, the sheer number of people it reaches, the degree to which kind of traditional institutions, sort of information institutions that had previously played a certain role in establishing a kind of a sense of truth. Whatever you think about, you know, how appropriate it was, it's not. I'm not suggesting that Walter Cronkite was actually telling us the exact truth of what happened every day, but but those notions are out the window. And then you have something like Facebook. So I think that ends up being a recipe for probably influence operations like on a scale that that nobody could have imagined in the past. Mm-hmm. The only other thing I would say, and I get into this a little bit in the podcast, but there are, I told the story of the film Zero Dark 30, and the kind of making of that film and the cooperation between the agency and the filmmakers was subsequently, a subject of an investigation. And so emails have come out and so forth. And to me, what was fascinating about that was that, I think that film was in some ways itself an influence operation. It wasn't really happening sub rosa, right? Like it was happening with the active cooperation of all kinds of folks in Hollywood and so forth. And somebody, I noticed there was a question asking if my podcast had itself been an influence operation, which is a very good question, and one that I tried to kind of be candid about my own, my own worries about those types of questions. But I would just say that I think for any filmmaker, podcaster, journalist, it does become a tricky thing, right? Because there's access is hard to come by, and there's a premium on access. And I think it's very often the case that access comes with a subtle price of one sort or another. So I think the CIA does this, but I think the Trump White House does this. There are various ways in which people are able, by selectively giving a certain kind of access to their version of the story, to amplify that version in a form that I think could probably be described as an influence operation.
So I know we're closing in on the hour, and we're so grateful for both of your time and thoughts on a fascinating conversation. And maybe Patrick, you'll just tell us in closing what you're working on next, or what your friend Michael is suggesting that you work on next, as we're all interested in the secrets you're going to reveal.
So Michael continues to prompt me with stories I should be writing. I am going to go back to the New Yorker soon. I've been on leave. I've been working on a book about the Sackler family and the opioid crisis, and so I will hopefully finish that up at some point in the fall, and it'll be out next year.
Terrific. Well, thank you both so much. It's really fascinating to learn about your expertise, and we really appreciate your time. And on behalf of everyone and the Marshall Scholars here, we're very grateful for your sharing your insights today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was really an honor.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.